country is in shock. This is after viral video surfaced depicting what appears to be a racist bullying at a school in Cape Town. Now, this incident comes shortly after the Pretoria High School for Girls incident. Now, a dozen pupils have been suspended after alleged inflammatory text messages were discovered. These incidents are happening during the 30th anniversary of South Africa's apartheid democracy. Let us now bring in clinical psychologist Prof.Saths Cooper. Prof, thank you so much. It's great to chat. It's so unimaginable to have children go through racism at school every day. What's the source of this problem?
The source of this racism in our country is that we have not dealt with racism. This was declared a crime against humanity in the 1960s by the United Nations. And when we got democracy 30 years ago, we had all sorts of Chapter 9 and 10 institutions dealing with a variety of issues, really only touching the surface, but not dealing with the centuries-old issue of racism. Racism has been embedded since colonial conquest, over 300 years ago with the arrival of Dutch settlers, and it has been systematically entrenched in our physical, in our psychological, in our intellectual, and importantly in our schooling spaces. 30 years later, we have not dealt with this in our school curriculum. The biggest thing we do is have our kids in school for a significant part of the day. They are supposed to learn about ourselves. They're supposed to deal with a variety of subjects to enable them to better be prepared for this the third decade of the 21st century. But our curriculum is still stuck in the old past. We don't have anything that we deal with racism and how to deal with ourselves and in engagement with the others. The result is racism is found in many forms, and when it's found in these very privileged spaces like the private school settings, it shows that people who are in power economically, in particular, have schooled and trained their kids to retain a superiority approach. Secondly, we have our political leaders in power that have done sweet nothing about this. You'll recall that the Pretoria Girls' School has erupted over time with hair, and more recently the chat group. And President Zuma, many of his ministers had their children in that school, and they stood by while parents were protesting with Zuleka Patel, I think her name was, and the same with all these other schools. Unfortunately, we will continue to have this as long as we don't change the curriculum, we don't train our children to understand themselves, that respect for the other comes from respect for self. You have these incidents when you have serious uncertainty with those expressing it, whether they're adults or children. They have identity crises. They may think they're superior, but they are very uncertain and insecure in how they deal with the other. The result is this outpouring of racism, and then, worse still, it is minimized by those in power in those institutions by saying it was an aberration. These aberrations cannot continue. They are actually infusing disability in their children by making them believe that they are superior, because they'll get out in the world and find that the world is very different from that which they see in their privileged, rich homes and in these school spaces. So I think we need to have a good dose of identity, black consciousness, if you like, to actually make everyone understand that if you know who you are and you really appreciate that, you will understand that everybody else around you is the same. We all have the same biology, except for reproduction, for procreation of the species. But outside of that, any intimation of intellectual, physical, and other superiority is crass, it's unscientific, and it's about time that we rid ourselves of these.
And Prof, just on that as well, you know, we talk so much about the long-term effects on apartheid and how some of its effects, or most of its effects, were able to trickle into this day South Africa. What are the long-term impacts of everyday racism in young people generally in a South African society when we look at today? And are we a nation that is able to look at the magnitude of this problem and actually be able to say, this is what needs to be done to ensure we chart a way forward?
Let me start with the last part of your question first. We don't have the capacity, we don't have the commitment, and we don't have any serious ability from our intellectual leadership in the society to deal with this, because nobody, you and me, all of us, especially the adults, have sequelae of racism. The result is that there's trauma intergenerationally. From those rich white homes, they are traumatizing their kids so that their kids behave in this way and believe that they are a different species. They don't identify as a human race. Indeed, our race classification laws from colonial times through apartheid have been retained on our statute books. And hence, children are not enabled to engage with each other on equal terms. They then believe they are something else. The myth of racism is a scourge that we cannot allow to perpetuate within our kids in particular. And these kids need to be really the flag bearers for a true humanity. But, and these are teenagers, they are growing within homes, within schools, believing in the apartheid of the mind. The mind is a terrible thing to deal with when you get confused like this. And therefore, what we need is a training, a schooling that is significantly different, that creates the ability for young kids to take their rightful place without regard for belief, for color, for any other issue that tends to separate them. They need to be looking as common citizens. We are all common citizens in this country. We are all human beings in this society, and therefore that needs to change. One of the serious issues is violence in our society, because that I see a close nexus between racism and violence and sexism, and that needs to change through a different way of engaging our children. For many, many administrations, the Psychological Society of this country has written to the presidency on these matters, not even an acknowledgement that this is happening. And of course, you see this in universities. You see how university students are treated, and the authorities say these are aberrations. They're not aberrations because people in the home environment, in the school environment, in the recreational environment, in the work environment, in corporate headquarters, people still believe They are superior. I have not come across a person, especially my torturers, who really was superior. Inside that brute was a little inferior, uncertain person. These kinds of outbursts come from a system of inferiorization of the self.
Okay, that was clinical psychologist Prof.Saths Cooper chatting to us there. Thank you so much for your insights, and of course just giving us some of his insights on that alleged racism incident that we saw there in the Western Cape, and obviously also just making sense of some of the conversations that have been had on this particular incident. And I think it was our reporter Colburn August, who brought us up to speed with what was happening there. Also, saying that some of the parents were not really in a position to talk to news outlets as soon as this incident happened. Understandably so, because this is quite a shocking incident to see come out there, especially when we look at how far we've come as a nation, looking at 30 years into democracy as well. And of course, the good prof touching on that as well.